Shryock. So he gave an elaborate speech. We have a complete copy of it, and we quote extensively from it. But this is just to give you a little flavor of what his mindset was as a 72-year-old man at the twilight of his career. He first recaps the satisfaction that he had gained in his life from working in architecture. And then he continues with an entreaty to the vast potential in American architecture. And he says, I hope men will rise above their present degraded and corrupt condition and become honest and pure in thoughts, words, and actions. And our architecture is so extremely simple and beautiful in style, so elegant, magnificent, and grand in proportion, and perfect and complete in its execution, as to become the admiration of the world and a model for imitation by all the nations of the earth. So he has retained that idealism and ambition and love of architect in his twilight years. I want to read briefly from his obituary, which was written by a man he'd known all his life. The writer of this has known, I'm quoting, has known him intimately for the space of 67 years. Mr. Shryock was a thorough master of this profession in all its parts. He followed his profession quietly, successfully. He was a very faithful member of the Baptist Church. He was an excellent husband, a kind father, and an earnest, excellent friend. He leaves a wife and 4 sons and 4 daughters who are worthy of such a father as they possessed. Now I want to close and leave a message from an old man, and that would be me, to Mr. Shryock, who's a much older man. And this is my message. Mr. Shryock, you were a very lucky fellow. You were born in a town and at a time in Lexington when building anything was the rage. Even that Greek revival outhouse that you built for old Morrison in Lexington. And that's one of the only original plans that he left that we have, which is a little bit ironic. You were born with high intelligence and a rare talent for architecture. You had loving parents and siblings. You can certainly see what his sister thought. And your father was a builder. How lucky is that? You got a good basic education from old Mr. Aldrich at the Lancastrian School. You got accepted to study with William Strickland, a fine architect and in a city of 65,000 persons. When you returned to Lexington, it wasn't long until the old state capitol burned. That was Frankfurt's tragedy, but it certainly was your good luck. But I want to say to you, you took full advantage of all the luck you had. You studied hard, and you educated yourself, and you mastered the history of architecture and how to build buildings. You became well educated, which no doubt enabled you to be conversant with the other well-educated persons who were your clients, and that would include people like Henry Clay, John Crittenden in Frankfurt, the John Pope that I mentioned, who was the governor of the territory, James Guthrie in Louisville, etc., etc. You were very courageous to undertake the designing of a building like the old state capitol. Your resume at the time you undertook that commission would have fit on a half a page, or a fourth of a page probably. And that could well have ruined your career. But you were courageous enough to accept the commission and you pulled it off. You also took your subsequent projects seriously. And you gave Lexington, Frankfurt, and Louisville something of which to be proud, and even Little Rock. It is obvious that you were a beloved son, sibling, husband, and father, And it must be a comfort to you that you are buried in Cave Hill Cemetery with all 9 of your children, and of course your wife. So I say, Mr. Shryock, for myself and your admirers, you are an inspiration and a role model for all of us, and we are grateful to you that you came our way. Thank you very much.
I'm going to try this headset. I hope it works. Get that out of the way. Well, thank you again to the Louisville Free Public Library for allowing us to host this event in this wonderful, wonderful room. This is just a treat. And I also want to thank Winfrey. He's a marvelous friend and a tremendous co-author to work with over, we calculated 16 years of 3 books, and 7 years, as he said, this last one. And believe it or not, through all that, we're still fantastic friends. And I think that says a lot. So, what I'm going to talk about today is entitled Gideon Shryock, Master of the Greek Revival. And I'm going to highlight an important part of our book. That is the first part of our book that discusses Gideon as the man who brings the Greek revival style of architecture in its full form to Kentucky. And in the process of doing that, becomes a significant and very key player in this national architectural movement. We'll be looking at, today, Shryock's education as an architect, because that undergirds his whole work, and then the evolution of his architecture through 3 notable works that we cover in the book, all of which are examples of Greek Revival architecture. But okay, I keep using this term. What, may say, is Greek Revival? Well, it's the fashion of its day. It's the fashionable style of its day, from Europe to the East Coast of the United States. And in the United States, it sweeps the country starting in the early 1800s, because this originates in Germany and Great Britain. Arrives in the East Coast, starting really with the Yorkish area and Philadelphia, and then works its way west and south. And it's not just architecture that is affected by the Greek Revival. It's all-encompassing. It includes fashion. It includes the naming of cities. For those of you who can't see that, this is Athens, Georgia. Furniture and interior design. Includes the fine arts and the decorative arts. And, of course, architecture. Here you see the territorial capital of Arkansas by Gideon Shryock. And in architecture, Greek Revival could simply be defined as the application of ancient Greek forms to modern-day uses. Now, I mentioned his education. Winfrey talked about Gideon's early education and mentioned that he studies under William Strickland. There we go. Let me elaborate on that just a minute. So, first of all, we know that Gideon grows up under his father, Matthias, who was a carpenter and builder of very great note in Lexington. We believe that he worked with his father and obviously demonstrated enough talent that in 1823, his family decided that he needed to go someplace and be trained formally. And that someplace was Philadelphia, which I show you here right before he arrived. Philadelphia, as I think many of you know at that time, was the big city of the United States. It was the cultural capital of the United States, and it was the center of architectural thought. When he arrived there, he would apprentice under William Strickland, who was one of the great masters of American architecture of this era. While working with Strickland, he learns the Greek Revival, he learns how to work in the Greek Revival. He embraces the Greek Revival and brings it home to Kentucky after he's been with Strickland for a mere 1 year. And when he returns to Kentucky, he carries with him the distinction of being the first native son of the state to be trained as an architect. Now, what happens when he's with Strickland? Well, he gets, as I said, formal training, such as it is, because at this time in 1823, there is no program in architecture in a university. That won't come until after the Civil War. So education at that point is based on the centuries-old system of apprenticeship, whereby the student studies under a master, in this case, William Strickland. There he observes, he copies, he assists, and oftentimes the student would work on a building that was under construction. So it was a comprehensive way of learning architecture, very hands-on. But when he's working with Strickland, I might add, that he's becoming a part of a very distinguished architectural fraternity that includes perhaps the most important and significant group of architects in this country at that time. This fraternity really starts with the English transplant Benjamin Latrobe, who had come to Philadelphia in 1798. And Latrobe is often considered the first professional architect in the United States. He's known for having overseen the construction of the United States Capitol in Washington and the rebuilding of the Capitol and the White House, which you see here, after the War of 1812. He actually did work in Kentucky as well, designing a home, the Pope Villa, for Senator John Pope, he who Winfrey mentioned as the governor of the Arkansas Territories. In the European tradition, Latrobe took on at least 2 apprentices that we know of. One was from South Carolina, Robert Mills, who would go on to design the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. The other is our friend William Strickland, whose first really notable building I show here, which was the Second Bank of the United States in Philadelphia. It's borrowed directly, the facade, from the Parthenon in Athens and is often considered the first Greek Revival building in this country. This building was finishing up when Gideon arrived in Philadelphia. Now, Strickland, in turn, took on at least 2 apprentices that we know of. One, Thomas Walter, who designed the great cast iron dome that stands atop the United States Capitol today. And then, of course, our friend Gideon Shryock. Now, thinking about Strickland for a moment and his second bank and that Parthenon, where did he get the idea for that? Because he had never been to Greece. Well, architects at this time, especially Greek Revival architects, relied on the use of pattern books, of these volumes that had been published that showed elements of architecture, in this case Greek architecture, plans, full buildings. They were used for inspiration and models and measurements, and importantly, to assist architects with understanding classical rules of proportion, something that Gideon picked up very, very well. I'm showing you 2 of the most popular of the era here. One is the Antiquities of Athens, published by James Stewart and Nicholas Rivette. The other, the Society of Dilettantes, Antiquities of Ionia, between the two of them covering ancient Greece on either side of the Adriatic. These are both going to be important to us as we move forward here with Gideon. So the authors of these books traveled to Greece, saw the ruins, sketched them, reconstructed them, and then they would see, for instance, certain little extant nuggets like this, the Tower of the Winds, an ancient water clock. And then, of course, they would sketch it and then etch it in their book, which became obviously very available. It included, such illustrations included things like plans with all the dimensions. So, for instance, if you were an English nobleman and you had your estate back home and you wanted a little guest house design to look very Grecian, well, you might turn to that and have it copied. And by the way, this has also been done. Clay Lancaster, from the Kentucky architectural historian, had this type of building built on his place, the Warwick estate near Harrodsburg, as a guest house. So that was in 1992. So the tradition continues. But one thing I want to point out is that Greek Revival architects were never just mere copyists. They used these books, they used ancient Greek forms as a springboard, as inspiration, because then they still had to take these forms and then adapt them for contemporary use, as we will see. For instance, in ancient Greek, the Tower of the Winds was a water clock. It wasn't 2 stories with a ballroom on the second floor that you can rent today with Georgian windows in it. Now, I said that Gideon stayed in Philadelphia for a year. And not long after he got back home to Lexington, there was a minor tragedy that Winfrey mentioned in Frankfurt, and that was that the State House, which was declared fireproof when it was built in 1816, you know what happens next? It burned to the ground. And about 2 years later, after much haggling, a competition was announced for its replacement. 21 days were provided for submission of proposals, but after only 7, the winner was declared, which was the young 25-year-old Gideon Shryock. Family lore says that the other competitors saw what Gideon had submitted and deemed it so superior to what they had designed that they withdrew their proposals. Needless to say, this was an amazing achievement for the 25-year-old Gideon, because at this point, to our knowledge, at least as the records indicate and what survives, he really hadn't designed anything of particular note. We believe he was working with his father while also working as an architect. But what he comes up with is truly a remarkable building that some consider to be his very, very best. Let's take a look at it. For his inspiration, he turned to none other than the Antiquities of Ionia, which I just mentioned. And there, thumbing through it, he locked on to the temple of Minerva Polias in Priene in modern-day Turkey. And this hexa-style, 6 columns, Ionic, the column capitals have the little ram's horns on them. This hexa-style Ionic column, temple front, he turned into his winning design, with the addition of a lantern on top. This is something else that you need to understand with Greek Revival architects, as we will see particularly with this building, that they're not purists. So he's borrowed the front from the temple, but then because temples did not have occupiable space inside, this is going to be a state house. He puts windows down the side and he needs to bring light into the center. So he, like other architects of his era, put a lantern on top to bring that light in. Now, he likely had other inspirations for his design of this building, in addition to the Temple of Minerva Polias, from his time in Philadelphia, starting with Benjamin Latrobe's Bank of Pennsylvania that had been built in 1799 before he arrived. So Gideon would absolutely have seen this, possibly sketched it, or possibly acquired the book printed in 1810 in which this illustration appeared. Or he could have seen British-American architect John Haviland's St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, also in Philadelphia, which was going up at the same time that he was there. The influences are uncanny between these. On the left, you have, down below, Gideon's proposal for the Capitol, and on the right down below, the Capitol is finally built as it exists today. So let's go inside for a moment and talk about that famed staircase that Winfrey mentioned earlier. Legend says it was a first. Well, it was actually a first west of the Alleghenies, because in New York, the City Hall there, a few years before, had built a stair like this out of stone as well. What's important to note here is that Gideon, in an early letter home from Philadelphia, told his parents that he would love to go to New York and to Baltimore if he had the time while he was up in Philadelphia. We don't know if he did. The record goes very quiet between his early letters home and when he wins the project for the Capitol, but it's quite possible. Regardless, as Winfrey mentioned, and I encourage you folks to go visit this building, the staircase is an amazing collaboration of stonemason, engineering talent, and architecture. Because, as Winfrey mentioned, it weighs, the whole thing weighs 21,000 pounds, which is, you have to manipulate all these stones. And that was calculated by our good guest here today, Tom Hundley. Thank you, Tom. This had been made before in wood, and so you know, if you haven't seen it, it's a stairway that is in a cylinder, and you go up the center flight, then there's a landing, then two other flights. They're floating flights. They come up, they're cantilevered off the wall, and then they go to the top, to the upper landing, to the second floor. And the genius of it is it's assembled as an arch really on an angle. And if you're familiar with how an arch works, it goes up with little pie-shaped bricks, stones, what have you, that by themselves would all fall down if it weren't for the keystone at the top that locks everything in place. Well, that's what Gideon has done with this stairway, is that there are the two flying flights on either side, crescent-shaped flights, that go up, and then that 2-ton landing locks them in place. And so all these steps, which are meticulously put together, had to be held up by some sort of wood framework until that final piece was put in. And then, you know, they pulled that framework out, everybody holding their breath. And of course, after that, I don't know if you would have done it, but you first up the stairs. Oh, no, you first up the stairs. But it is a remarkable, remarkable piece of work. Now let's go up those stairs, we're brave, into this glorious rotunda. Where do we think that Gideon might have drawn inspiration for this? He could have come up with the idea on his own, or perhaps he made it to Baltimore, where he had family, while he was in Philadelphia, and saw this, the first Unitarian church, the sanctuary of which had been built just a few years before. Or he might have stayed in touch with his cohort in Strickland's office and been aware of this chapel at Strickland's United States Naval Hospital in Philadelphia that was started just shortly before Gideon won the award for the Capitol. What's important here to understand is that Gideon doesn't go to Philadelphia, study for a year, and come back home and hang up a shingle and design pretty houses. He is staying in touch with what is happening in the rest of the country, particularly what is happening in the Northeast around Philadelphia, that cultural capital. He is part of this mix. He may even have made it back to Philadelphia in that time between when we know he returned home and when we know he won the competition. It's very likely that he was either letters, drawings exchanged, or he actually made it back there. And the building is still remarkable today. If you haven't seen it, go. This is an image from the 1920s, and here it is today, where you can see how important that lantern was to his composition. Not only does it bring in light, but it gives additional monumentality to his facade. And one other little detail I want to point out to you that's so wonderful about this, and shows how attentive he was to his architecture, is note that the stone used on the portico itself, the columns and the pediment above, is that kind of darker yellow color set against the wall and back, which is a definitely lighter color, which lets that classical portico read through with tremendous strength. This, for Frankfurt at this time, this had to be quite something to see. Now let's move on to the next project of Gideon's career, the next major project, and that's Morrison College at Transylvania University in Lexington. And here we have what's going to be a familiar story, because the principal building at Transylvania, lovely thing, in 1829, well, guess what happened to it? You guessed it, it burned to the ground, leaving nothing but this pile of ashes. And something else, it left, just like Frankfurt, an architectural opportunity. Let me backtrack just a little bit, give you a little bit of information, a little background on this. Go back to about 1822 or so, when the wealthy entrepreneur, Colonel James Morrison, had his good friend, famed Kentucky statesman Henry Clay, draft his will. And in that will, Morrison left Transylvania $30,000, a very princely sum, to be used to build a building at Transylvania to be named Morrison College. Now, Morrison dies in 1823, and time passes with the usual arguments in there about the estate, but the burning of the old building provided that perfect reason to wrap up all the controversy with his legacy and get going. And so they do. And Transylvania asks for submissions again. And they receive at least two. This one, kind of a riff on Jefferson's Monticello, is by a Mr. Lawkins. That's all we know about him. The other is by Gideon, of course, who wins the competition, likely for two reasons. One, that his fame for the Kentucky State House, and two, for the building that really satisfies what they were looking for. It's a superior building. And I'll explain about that